Today, we'll explore the critical topic of API versioning. Understanding how to effectively manage versions is essential for maintaining robust applications. We will dive into API versioning library, its setup, and best practices. This presentation will cover definitions and significance of API versioning, the challenges it addresses, and the overview of an API versioning library. We will discuss setting it up in C#, various techniques for versioning APIs, advanced configuration options, and strategies for testing and maintaining different API versions. API versioning is a process that enables developers to make changes to an API without disrupting existing client applications. It is crucial for the longevity and adaptability of APIs in a changing software landscape. API versioning refers to the practice of maintaining multiple versions of an API. It is important because it allows developers to introduce new features and improvements while clients with the option to use older versions. Versioning addresses several challenges, including backward compatibility, the need for gradual deprecation, and supporting multiple clients that may require different API versions, different API features, or behaviors. The API versioning library for ASP.NET Core provides a robust framework for managing API version. It simplifies the process of versioning APIs by offering standard practices and built-in functionalities. To effectively use API versioning, the first step is to set up the API versioning library in your C# project. This includes installing the library and configuring your application for versioning. Begin by installing the API versioning library via NuGet Package Manager. This can be done through Visual Studio Interface or by using Package Manager console with the appropriate commands. Next, you will need to configure the API versioning library in startup.cs or program.cs. This involves adding services and configuration options to specify how versioning will be handled across your API. Once the library is installed and configured, you can implement basic versioning in your API controllers. This includes using attributes to specify version numbers and handling requests accordingly. There are several techniques available for API version, each with its own advantages and trade-off. Understanding these techniques will help you choose the best approach for your application. One common technique is query string versioning, where the version number is included as query parameter in the URL. This approach is straightforward and easy to implement. URL path versioning involves including the version number directly in the URL path. This is clear and explicit way to indicate the API version being used and is favored by many developers. Header version allows clients to specify the API version in request headers. This method keeps the URL cleaner but requires clients to understand and implement header usage. For more complex APIs, advanced configuration and customization options are available. These allow you to tailor versioning to meet specific application needs. You can define multiple version sets to manage different groups of API versions. This is useful for supporting various clients that may require different features or functionalities. Implementing versioning policies enable you to specify rules for how versions are handled. This includes defining how long version will be supported and when they should be deprecated. Customization of versioning conventions let you define your own approach to API versioning. This flexibility allows you to align with industry's best practices or specific organizational requirements. As your application evolves, testing and maintaining API versions is crucial for ensuring compatibility and functionality across different clients. Implementing unit tests for each API version to ensure that changes or new features do not break existing functionality. This helps maintain reliability and user satisfaction. When a version of the API is no longer needed, it's important to deprecate it properly. Communicate changes to the client and provide a timeline for when they should transition to a newer version. Implementing strategies that facilitate smooth transition between API versions. This may include providing migration guidelines, maintaining backward compatibility, and offering support during transition. So let's look at an API versioning sample. I have organized it. I have some API versioning using date, something is as V1, V2, and a neutral controller that's going to report on health. To get API versioning with Swagger control, we just need to add the API Explorer NuGet package. It in turn has dependency on the packages that support API, so it'll get indirectly included. So once this package is added to your project, then in services, we need to go and add API versioning. This can be done in program.cs or startup.cs. And then there are multiple options, and you can read about all those on the API versioning GitHub site. Example here is report API version. Here, if it is returning, if it's true, when you make a call to the service will respond back and say all the API versions that are available. This is the way to set sunset policy, where you can say that this API is going to be deprecated in 60 days. Of course, use some hard-coded data. This will keep moving, just as an example here. And then finally, we need to add a MVC, which is API versioning MVC part of it, and then API Explorer, so that a Swagger has the information it needs. Now, then you can go to each of your controller, add the specific versions. Here, there's a controller that supports 2 different versions, of which one of them is deprecated. And here's a way to do date-based API versioning. And then the fourth part is to write the code necessary to support OpenAPI so that Swagger page will have all the information you need. For that, I would say just refer to this C# files and see how those things are set up. Once you have Swagger configured, here is how different versions of the API is added to Swagger. So when you call describe API versions, it's going to come up with a description for each version, and then we loop through all of them and add them up. So you will see a drop down where you can pick the version you're interested in. Let's take a look at the code here. So here I have the date-based API versioning. Let's start with program.cs, where we talked about here's where we add the API versioning. And then here's reporting and sunset policy set, and adding API versioning Explorer here. And this is for multiple versions. We want to have a drop down so that we can pick the specific API versioning, and that part is done here. So we have API versioning based on date. There's a neutral controller where this is the health controller, so it's the same. And we don't need to pass any API versioning to hit this controller. And then there's a V1 and V3 methods. Here on orders, where order controller takes in its API versioning as a query string. So this is the entry that we need to give. To have it come in through the URL, you can put something like this. You can say V and the API versioning number. So now it's part of the URI. So if I were to call it passing V1, it'll go here, where same as if I pass the 0.9 controller, it'll also end up here. And that's how we can support multiple API versioning on a single controller. The most common usage when I use is date-based. So this is how date-based would look like. We call API versioning, we give it a date. And it's also recommended to use it as a query parameter, because when you're passing it through URL this way, then it means the URI is different per version. And that's kind of against the REST policy, which says you should have a unique resource locator for a given resource. So then I would expect it to have the exact same URI. It's just because I'm dealing with the exact same underlying resource, but the way the attributes, the input and output parameters may vary based on the version. So I prefer the versioning to be passed as part of the URL. So now let's look at the example running. Since we have 3 versions, we can see that we have this drop down with all the different versions that we saw. And it's only going to show those specific routes that are available. If I go in, so I go on this database version, and here I have shown both the versions. There's one orders. If I try to hit get on this, let's try this out. Let's pass it some parameter like 3 and hit execute. Notice how the API versioning is now passed as a query string to this particular controller. Whereas if I did the same thing with people, the version information is going as part of the URI. The recommended approach is to use query string and not the URL version, because this means you're pointing the exact same resource, but the URI is changing. If we want to take a look at the stuff with numbers on it, let's try this out. Execute. Here is API versioning again as a query parameter. And if we come down here, let's try this out, put some value, execute, and we can see that the version is being passed as part of the URI. So this is it, basics of getting API versioning working in your code. In conclusion, API versioning is a vital practice for maintaining effective and reliable APIs. By leveraging the API versioning library in C#, developers can implement versioning strategies that enhance their API's longevity and usability.